Story number 1. The Night Stalkers. We moved to the small suburban neighborhood of Hawthorne Estates nearly a year ago, chasing the dream of a quiet life. It wasn't the first time we'd uprooted ourselves, but this time, it was different. I thought we'd found the perfect spot, a place that would offer us peace, away from the clamor of the city. The houses were spaced far enough apart to give us some privacy, yet close enough to form a sense of community. Trees lined the streets, their limbs heavy with green, casting long shadows on the pavement. It was the type of neighborhood where people waved as they drove by, and children played hopscotch on the sidewalks after school. The first few weeks were idyllic. My wife, Linda, settled into her new routine of work and homemaking. The kids, Samantha, our 12-year-old, and Nathan, who was 9, made friends easily. It seemed like everything was falling into place. We quickly grew fond of the neighborhood, or so we thought. It was late autumn when the oddities began. At first, it was little things, small, unexplainable details that I tried to brush off as nothing. One evening, while I was sitting in the living room reading, I heard it, soft footsteps, creaking above me. I thought maybe it was just the house settling, but the sounds persisted, slow, deliberate, as if someone was walking around on the roof. Linda, half lost in a magazine, didn't seem to notice. I mentioned it to her the next morning. "You're probably just hearing things," she said, chuckling softly. But that evening, it happened again. The footsteps, and this time, I was sure there was no mistaking it. I didn't know what to make of it. Maybe some local kids had taken to playing pranks on us. But the odd thing was, I never saw anyone around. No footprints in the yard. No sounds of laughter or shouting. Just the soft, steady tread above. It went on for days, the eerie shuffling across the roof, each time growing a little closer to my breaking point. Then came the knocking. Started one night, just past midnight. A rapid, deliberate knock on the front door. My heart skipped. I checked the clock. 12:13 a.m. I wasn't expecting anyone. We didn't have many visitors in those early months, and certainly no late-night ones. I glanced out the window, but saw nothing, no shadow, no figure lurking by the door. I was about to turn back when the knock came again. Louder this time, more insistent. I checked the peephole, just to make sure. Nothing. The porch light flickered as if it too was unsure of what it was seeing. I opened the door, but the porch was empty. Cold air rushed in, and I stood there for a long moment, staring into the night. A strange stillness filled the air, a weight that seemed to press down on everything, as though the world itself had paused. I closed the door quickly, locking it behind me, but that night, the knocking didn't stop. Came again. At the same time, 12:13 a.m., and again the next night. Each time, I would check, but each time, I'd find nothing. It wasn't just the door, though. The noises began to grow. Sometimes, I would hear the scraping sound of nails against the walls, or a soft whisper in the air, almost imperceptible but unmistakable, as though someone was just beyond the reach of sight, waiting. Linda didn't hear it, or at least, she didn't admit to it. She told me I was just letting my imagination run wild. But something was wrong. I could feel it. The tipping point came when I caught a glimpse of something through the window one night. It was late, around the same time as the knocking. I saw movement in the corner of my eye. Figures, gathered in the shadow of the trees. I could make out their outlines, seated around a flickering fire. Their faces were hidden, obscured by something dark, hoods, maybe, or masks. But it wasn't just the strange gathering that unsettled me. It was the way they sat, perfectly still, unnaturally so, as if they were waiting for something. The fire cast long shadows on the ground, and in those shadows, something glinted, a flash of red. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my jacket and rushed outside, hoping to confront whatever it was. Linda protested, telling me to stay inside, but I couldn't ignore it. I had to know. I reached the edge of the yard and stopped. The figures didn't move. They didn't acknowledge me, but I could feel their eyes on me. Piercing, cold. My throat tightened. I wanted to call out, but the words stuck in my chest. Frozen by fear. As I stood there, frozen in place, a smell hit me sickly, sweet, like rotting meat mixed with something metallic. I gagged and stepped back. But then I saw it. Blood. It was smeared on the hands of one of the figures, staining the ground beneath them. Their hands were covered in it, their fingers glistening in the firelight. My heart pounded, the air thick with panic. I turned to run, but the sound of footsteps, no. Heavy boots pounded behind me. They were following me. I didn't look back, but I could hear them getting closer. I reached the front door, fumbling with the handle, and slammed it shut just as I heard the first soft knock. Then another. This time, the knock didn't stop. It came, again and again, louder and louder, as if they were trying to break through. The phone rang. I jumped, heart thudding in my chest, and grabbed the receiver. It was the police, responding to the noise complaints. "They're here," I said, my voice tight with panic. "There's something wrong. Someone is out there." Before I could say more, the line went dead. I don't know what happened next. The police never came. They told me the next day that no one had been sent out, that no one had even gotten the call. But I saw them, those figures in the firelight. I saw their hands, and I knew they were still out there, somewhere, watching. The next morning, I drove around the neighborhood, trying to make sense of it. I passed by the familiar homes, houses just like ours, neatly kept, with well-maintained lawns and freshly trimmed hedges. But when I reached the cul-de-sac, something was wrong. The street was deserted, the houses empty, as if all the people had simply vanished. I parked the car, feeling a pit in my stomach. The front door to the house next door was wide open. I walked up to it, hesitant. The house was untouched. The furniture was neatly arranged, the kitchen spotless, the lights still on, as if the owners had just stepped out. But there was something about the place, something hollow, the feeling of someone not being there. That's when I heard it again, the soft scraping sound, from upstairs. I ran, back to my car, back to my family. Linda told me the police had come, but when they arrived, the yard was empty again. No sign of the figures, no blood, only the same quiet, empty neighborhood. No one believes me. No one has seen the figures. The police think it was a prank, a mistake, something I'd imagined. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. The knocking hasn't stopped. Every night, just past midnight, it's the same knock. 3 hard raps. And sometimes, I hear their voices again, soft whispers. Voices in the wind, just on the edge of hearing. They're still out there, watching, waiting, and no one is safe. Not even here, not even now. Story number 2. The Neighbor and the Mysterious Painting. When we moved to the quiet suburb of Hawthorne, I thought we were escaping the chaos of the city. It was a small, sleepy town where nothing out of the ordinary ever happened. The kind of place where children could ride their bikes without fear, where the sun set every night with a golden promise of peace. Julia, my wife, and I were excited to start fresh, to build a new life for our family. We bought a small house on Elm Street, nestled between 2 other homes that looked just as unremarkable. The house next to ours, however, was a different story. The elderly man who lived there was a reclusive figure, someone who kept to himself. I never saw him out during the day, but there was always a faint light flickering from his window after dark, casting a strange, orange glow on the snow-covered yard. I noticed the little things, the oddities that most people might miss. It was all too subtle, but too deliberate, like a lingering shadow just out of reach. First, it was his windows, always closed tight, always locked. Then there were the paintings. I couldn't help but notice them. I could see them through the curtains when I stood in our living room, just staring back at me, staring back at the house. The paintings, they were always the same. A family gathered around a table, eating dinner, peaceful scene. one that might remind someone of a Norman Rockwell print. If it weren't for the eyes of the people in those paintings were wrong. They glowed red, an eerie, unnatural shade that stood out against the dull, warm tones of the room, and they weren't just staring ahead, like normal people in a dinner scene. No, they were all staring directly at me, at our house, as though they could see through the walls, as if they knew me, watched me, studied me every time I passed by. I didn't mention it to Julia at first. I thought I was imagining things. But one night, after we'd tucked the kids into bed and were winding down with a movie, I couldn't ignore it any longer. I looked out the window to see the old man's house across the street, and I saw one of the paintings shift. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The canvas moved, just a little, as if the air in the room had pushed it, or maybe something else had. The movement was slow, deliberate, like a living thing. My heart skipped a beat. I turned to Julia, who was in the kitchen, and I asked her if she had seen it. "What?" she replied, her voice soft. "Seen what?" "The painting. It moved." She came to the window, peered across the street. The house was dark now. No lights, no flickering orange glow. It looked empty. But when I looked back at the paintings through the window, I saw something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The eyes of the family in the painting were still glowing red. They were still staring at us. But now, their faces seemed to twist in a grotesque manner, as though something deep within them was pushing at the surface. Something dark and wrong. I couldn't stand it anymore. I turned away from the window, trying to shake the unsettling feeling that had crept into my bones. That night, sleep didn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those eyes, burning bright red, staring into me. Every time I heard the creak of the house settling, I imagined the sound was coming from that old house next door, from the man who was always in there, always watching. The next day, I told Julia we should ask about the paintings. I wanted to know what the hell was going on. So, we walked across the street to visit the old man. His house, as usual, was dark, but there was no sign of life, no movement, no flicker of light from the window. We knocked and waited, but no one answered. I knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. "We should leave," Julia said, pulling at my sleeve, a nervous edge in her voice. "This doesn't feel right." But before I could turn to leave, I heard a sound from inside, a low creaking, like a door slowly being pushed open. And then, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the corner of the window, there was a shape, a figure, half hidden in the shadows, standing just beyond the curtains. I didn't get a good look, but I could feel it, that feeling, the sensation that someone was watching me, waiting for something I couldn't understand. I knocked again, louder, demanding to know if anyone was home, but the figure didn't move. "I'm calling the police," Julia said, grabbing my arm, her voice shaking. Before I could stop her, she turned and started back toward our house. But just as we reached our front yard, I felt a chill in the air, a sudden drop in temperature that made my breath fog in front of me. I turned around, instinctively, and I saw something that made my stomach twist into knots. The curtains of the old man's house were parted, just a little, and behind them, one of the paintings was gone. I didn't tell Julia what I'd seen. I couldn't bring myself to, but when I looked again, I saw something else. The eyes of the family in the other paintings, the ones that hadn't moved, were still glowing red. But now, they weren't staring at me anymore. They were staring at her. Julia. At our house. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. The next night, the atmosphere in our house was thick with tension. We tried to ignore it, tried to go on as if everything was normal. But the unease lingered. The paintings, the eyes, the way they watched us, it all felt like we were being drawn into something we couldn't escape. And then, late that night, it happened. We were lying in bed, trying to sleep, when we heard a noise outside. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, a soft scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then, the scraping sound was joined by another noise, whispering. Low voices, just on the edge of hearing, speaking words I couldn't understand. I jumped out of bed, grabbed my flashlight, and rushed downstairs. Julia followed behind me, her face pale with fear. As we reached the front door, the whispers grew louder, clearer. They were coming from across the street, from the old man's house. Help, help, help. The voice was faint, muffled, but unmistakable. I could barely make it out, but there was no mistaking it. It was coming from the painting. I ran outside, flashlight in hand, Julia right behind me. We rushed across the street, but when we reached the old man's house, there was no sign of life. The windows were dark, and the door was locked. No answer when we knocked. I reached for the handle, my hand trembling, turned easily. The door creaked open, as though it hadn't been closed in years. Inside, the house was cold and empty. No lights, no furniture, just an old, decaying structure that had clearly been abandoned for years. But as we stepped into the hallway, I saw it. The room at the end of the hall, bathed in a faint glow. It was the painting, the one that had moved. It was hanging on the wall. But now, it wasn't just the family sitting at the table. The painting had changed. The family members were now standing in front of the table, their red eyes glowing brighter than ever. And behind them, in the darkness, there was a shadow, a figure, standing just outside the frame, watching us. And it was smiling. I turned and ran, dragging Julia with me. We burst out the door and into the night. I never saw the old man again after that. No one in the neighborhood could say what happened to him, and no one could explain the paintings. But every night, when I close my eyes, I can still see those eyes, red, burning, staring at me from across the street, watching, waiting. And I know that somehow, they'll never stop watching. They'll never stop waiting. Story number 3. Nightmare of the Old Neighbor. I remember the first time I saw him. It was a bright autumn day, crisp air filling my lungs as I stood at the edge of my new front porch, looking out across the quiet street. We had just moved into the old house on Maple Street, a place that, on the surface, seemed perfect for starting fresh. A family of 4, full of hope and ambition, coming to put down roots in a town that, on the surface, looked as though it hadn't changed in 50 years. A town with no mysteries, no secrets, and yet, something felt off. There was a presence in that neighborhood, something not right, something just barely hidden beneath the layers of normality. It was as if the place had been shaped by dark hands, the edges fraying with unspoken truths. The people seemed kind enough, but everyone had a distance to them, an air of watchfulness that kept the warmth just out of reach. And then there was him, Mr. Blackwell. He lived in the grand house 2 doors down from us, a stone mansion, old but kept up with precision, almost too precisely. He was the kind of man who could only be described as cold, tall, with an immaculately groomed beard, sharp eyes, and a face that rarely cracked a smile. At least, not that I ever saw. He was always in his yard, tending to the garden or standing by his wrought iron gate, staring at something beyond the horizon. If you caught him watching you, his gaze was unsettlingly intense. He had a way of making you feel like you were being sized up, judged, as if you were an insect caught in his scrutiny. But still, we were new to the area. My wife, Julia, and I had little to go on beyond the superficial interactions we had with him. The short greetings when we saw him walking by. He seemed to take no real interest in us, just a polite nod here, a tip of the hat there. But something about him gnawed at me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something hidden behind those cold eyes. Then, things started to get strange. It all began one night when Julia and I decided to clean out the attic. It was the kind of attic that had been untouched for years, filled with old furniture, boxes, and a thick layer of dust that covered everything like a shroud. As I was sifting through the piles of forgotten belongings, I came across an old wardrobe. I can still picture it now. Dark wood, polished to a faint gleam, but clearly aged. The smell of mildew and must filled the air when I opened the doors, revealing a row of old coats and jackets. But tucked at the back, hidden behind the fabric, was a leather-bound book. I pulled it out, curious, and blew off the dust, revealing an old journal. The cover was cracked, and the pages inside were yellowed with age. The ink, though faded, was still legible. I flipped through it, half expecting it to be the ramblings of a forgotten ancestor or some long-lost family history. But what I found inside sent a chill down my spine. The journal was written in the first person, and it chronicled the life of none other than Mr. Blackwell. I don't know what possessed me to read it. I could have tossed it in the trash and forgotten about it. But instead, I found myself turning page after page, absorbed by the dark account that seemed to pull me in against my will. The entries at first seemed harmless enough, mundane even, recounting Mr. Blackwell's daily routines, his observations of the neighborhood, his feelings toward the people who lived nearby. But then, things started to take a darker turn. As I read, the words blurred and twisted in my mind, like a cloud of smoke rising from the pages. The tone of the journal became more erratic, more manic. One entry stood out among the rest. It read, "The house is empty tonight. I hear the whispers of those who lived here before. I hear them. I see them. Their faces in the mirrors. It's almost time. Another one will come. I'll be ready." At first, I thought it was a random thought, a man losing his grip on reality. But then I found another entry. "They've come. They always come in the dark. They never see it coming. It's the perfect way to make them disappear. Quietly, in the night, as though they were never here at all. And when the morning comes, no one will remember. No one will even question it." And then there was another. "The house on the corner. It's empty now, but it wasn't before. It's a matter of time before they come looking for me. I'll hide in the shadows. I'll wait. Then, they'll vanish, just like the others. No one will know. No one ever does." The pages went on, each entry more disturbing than the last, all referring to disappearances in the neighborhood, disappearances of people who had lived in the houses before. And every one of those disappearances occurred on the very street where I now lived. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I realized something. Those were not just random musings. They were real events. Mr. Blackwell had been involved in something unspeakable. And those words, those dark, twisted thoughts, sounded too much like a confession. The worst part, the thing that kept me awake at night, was the final entry. It was written in an almost frantic scrawl, as though the author was trying to get the words down before something caught him. It read, "The next house is the one at the end of the street. I've been watching. I know them. It won't take long." That was the last page in the journal. It was dated 3 months before we moved into our house. I didn't sleep that night. I sat up, staring at the journal, trying to understand what it all meant. How many people had disappeared in that neighborhood? How many houses had been left empty, abandoned without any real explanation? And why hadn't anyone told us about this before? It was as though no one wanted to talk about it. Like the dark history of the street was buried beneath layers of quiet denial. In the days that followed, I started to watch Mr. Blackwell more closely. I paid attention to the way he walked, the way he interacted with people. He never seemed to speak to anyone for too long. And when he did, his eyes always seemed to linger on the faces of others, calculating something I couldn't quite grasp. He would disappear for days at a time, sometimes weeks, and no one ever seemed to know where he went. Then, one evening, something happened that sent the chill in my bones deeper. I was out in the yard, trimming the hedges, when I noticed Mr. Blackwell standing in his front yard, staring at me. His gaze was intense, unblinking, and something in the way he looked at me made my blood run cold. I gave a quick wave, trying to brush off the unease creeping up my spine. But then I saw it. In the window of his house, a shadow moved. I could swear I saw the outlines of a figure standing behind the glass. Watching me, it was a person, or something that resembled one, standing in the dark. I blinked, and when I looked back, the figure was gone. But the feeling, oh God, the feeling lingered. That sense of being watched, of being followed, never left. It started to bleed into my daily life. I began to feel eyes on me everywhere I went, on my walks, in the grocery store, in the middle of the night when I lay awake. It was only a few days later when the first disappearance occurred. The neighbor across the street, a young family with 2 small children, was gone without a trace. The police came and searched the house, but there was nothing to indicate a struggle. No signs of forced entry, no explanation, just an empty house. And then, it happened again. Another house, another family, another empty space. Soon, I realized the pattern. It was happening all around us. And the house on Maple Street, our house, was next. I started packing, planning our escape. But before we could leave, something stopped me. A knock on the door. It was Mr. Blackwell. He stood there, his cold eyes fixed on me. "You're leaving," he said, his voice a low growl. "You think you can escape it? You think you can escape me? There's no escaping your fate." He smiled then, a thin, wicked grin that sent ice crawling through my veins. I don't know what happened next. My memory of that night is fragmented, shattered like glass. But when I woke up the next morning, I was back in my bed, and the house was eerily quiet. The journal, the calls, the disappearances, they had all been real. And now, I was the one who had become part of the story. Because in the end, it's not the houses that vanish. It's the people. And it's always the ones who look away that get taken. I won't be here much longer. I can feel the eyes on me, closing in. It's only a matter of time before I disappear. 2. Story number 4. The mysterious neighbor and the strange calls. It was a cold winter's evening when the first call came, though it was far from the last. I remember that night as if it were burned into my memory. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows of our home, and the world seemed cloaked in an eerie silence that made everything feel just a little too still. My wife, Ellen, was sitting on the couch, reading a book, while our 2 children, Sarah and Sam, were already tucked into bed upstairs. It was the kind of peaceful evening that could lull you into thinking nothing ever went wrong in the world. Then the phone rang. The sound of it cut through the calm like a knife, sharp and sudden. I wasn't expecting a call, not at that hour, but I reached for the receiver nonetheless. The voice on the other end was low and raspy, almost as if it had to force its way through a thick fog. "Ken then. Hong exoam qua ben kong phi la nuoi ma ban gi." I froze. It was in Vietnamese. The words, though foreign to me, felt strangely familiar, like a warning from a place I couldn't quite place. The voice didn't say anything more. It was just those words, repeated over and over in my mind. "Be careful. Your neighbor is not who you think they are." My heart raced in my chest, the unease gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. The call ended abruptly, leaving only the hum of the phone line. I sat there for a moment, trying to shake the feeling that I was missing something. Who could have called? How did they know about us? I looked over at Ellen, who had put down her book and was watching me with a concerned expression. I must have looked pale, or at least more unsettled than I realized. "Who was that?" she asked, her voice gentle but laced with worry. "I don't know," I replied, shaking my head, trying to dismiss the creeping dread in my gut. "Wrong number, I guess." But something didn't sit right. The tone of the voice, the peculiar warning, it all felt too deliberate. I didn't want to scare Ellen, so I let it go. We went about our evening, the strange call slipping to the back of my mind, at least for the moment. The next night, the same thing happened. Same time, same call, and again, those same words. "Ken then. Hong exoam qua ben kong phi la nuoi ma ban gi." I was on edge by then, my nerves frayed, and the sense of unease hanging over me like a thick fog. I told Ellen about the second call, and this time, She was just as unsettled as I was. There was no rational explanation for it. The caller had no reason to know about us. No reason to know anything about our neighbor. The neighbor in question was Mr. Fenton. He was a quiet man, living alone in the house next to ours. A little older than us, maybe in his mid-60s, with gray hair and a hunched back. He didn't have visitors, never threw parties or made any noise. He kept to himself. And for the most part, we didn't think much of him. He was the kind of neighbor you'd wave to from your driveway and then quickly forget about. But now I couldn't stop thinking about him. Was he the one calling us? What could it mean that someone would go to such lengths to warn us about him? And why was it always that cryptic message? The third call came a few nights later, and this time, I wasn't going to ignore it. I waited, my hand trembling as I picked up the receiver. I held it to my ear, listening to the silence for a moment before the voice came, steady but unervingly familiar. Ken then. Hong exoam qua ben kong fi la nuoi ma ban gi. I slammed the phone down in frustration, almost willing myself not to be scared. But it wasn't working. Each night the calls came, and each night they left me with more questions than answers. They were becoming more frequent, and I began to fear that I was losing my grip on reality. The warning, the voice, the tone, they had begun to invade my thoughts during the day, whispering to me in the quiet spaces between moments. And then one night, something happened that shattered any illusion of peace we'd been clinging to. It was just after midnight. I had been lying awake in bed, unable to sleep, the haunting words of the calls replaying over and over in my mind. Ellen was asleep beside me, her breathing slow and steady, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, like something was about to happen. A sudden rustle outside the window broke the silence, followed by a faint tapping sound. My heart skipped a beat. I turned toward the window, straining my ears to listen. There it was again, a faint tapping, as if someone was gently knocking on the glass. My first instinct was to get up and check, but fear kept me frozen in place. Could it be Mr. Fenton? Was he out there? I slowly slid out of bed and crept toward the window, careful not to wake Ellen. I pulled back the curtain just enough to see outside. What I saw made my blood run cold. Mr. Fenton was standing in front of our window, staring into the house. His face was expressionless, his eyes dark, hollow. He was motionless, as if he had been standing there for hours. I gasped, stumbling back, and nearly knocked over a lamp. Ellen woke with a start, groggily rubbing her eyes. She asked me what was wrong, but all I could do was point at the window. My voice stuck in my throat. She looked, but by the time she turned her head, Mr. Fenton was gone. There was no sign of him, no footprints, no rustling in the bushes. He had simply vanished. I ran downstairs and outside, hoping against hope that I would find him, to explain the situation. But there was nothing, no trace of him anywhere. It was as if he had never been there at all. The police came the next day, of course, after I called them to report the incident. But they found nothing, no evidence, no signs of forced entry, and no trace of Mr. Fenton. They chalked it up to an overactive imagination. An odd, perhaps unsettling coincidence. But I knew better. That night, I could hardly sleep. I kept hearing things, footsteps in the hall, whispers from the other side of the wall. But every time I checked, there was nothing there, just silence. The unsettling silence of a house that felt wrong. Days passed, and everything seemed to go back to normal. The calls stopped. The windows were clear. The knocking ceased. But the questions, those questions, remained. What had happened to Mr. Fenton? Where had he gone? Had he ever been the person we thought he was? I can tell you this now, though. I haven't seen Mr. Fenton in over a month. And the strangest part? No one remembers him. Not a single person I've asked in the neighborhood can recall ever seeing him. And those calls, the ones that warned us, they never came again. But there's something else now, something I can't shake. Every time I walk past the window, I catch myself staring out at the house next door, hoping for some sign, any sign, that the nightmare is over. but all I see is emptiness. And the nagging feeling that, somewhere out there, Mr. Fenton is still watching, still waiting, and I have no idea if he ever was who I thought he was. But the voice that warned me, I still hear it, late at night, when the house is too quiet. Ken then. Hong exoam qua ben kong fi la nuoi ma ban gi. Be careful, because sometimes, the truth is far worse than what you can imagine. Story number 5. The neighbor haunted by the past. There's something about the past that clings to you. I didn't know that back then. When my family and I first moved into the old house on Briarwood Lane, we were just looking for a fresh start, a way to escape the grind of city life and live in peace, away from the noise and the constant rush, a place where we could raise our kids in a quiet, suburban neighborhood. Briarwood seemed perfect. At first, the house had an old charm to it, dark wood floors, tall windows, and a stone fireplace that filled the living room with warmth on those cold autumn nights. The kind of house that looked like it had 1,000 stories to tell. But it also had a certain weight, like the house was holding onto its past, unwilling to let it go. I didn't pay much attention to it at first. I was too busy with the move, trying to get the kids settled and unpacked. But soon, things started happening, small things at first, easily dismissible. A light left on when we were sure it had been turned off. A door that creaked open on its own when no one was near. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, the normal noises of an old building adjusting to its new inhabitants. But then there was the neighbor. His name was Mr. Halloran, an elderly man who lived next door in a house that looked just as old, if not older, than ours. He was always home. I never saw him leave, and he never had visitors. He would sit in his front yard in a rocking chair, staring at our house. At first, it was subtle, a glance here and there, just an old man enjoying the view. But as the days passed, I began to notice something more unsettling. He was watching us. He didn't look away. He didn't wave or nod like a friendly neighbor would. He just stared, as if something about us was too interesting for him to ignore. Sometimes, when I'd catch his gaze, he'd smile just a little, though it never reached his eyes. Those eyes were cold, distant, like they had seen too much and were haunted by things no one should know. I tell myself it was nothing. Old people do strange things, I think. Maybe he was just lonely. But every time I passed his house or looked out the window, I'd feel that uncomfortable sense that he was always watching, always waiting. It wasn't just me. My wife, Jennifer, started noticing it too. And the kids, well, they were a little more perceptive than I gave them credit for. My son, Liam, began to ask questions about Mr. Halloran. "Why does he always look at us?" he'd ask, his eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and fear. "Maybe he's just lonely," I'd say, trying to brush it off. But it never quite worked. The feeling that we weren't alone, that there was something strange about Mr. Halloran's presence, never quite went away. Then came that stormy night in late October. The rain came down in sheets, heavy and relentless. The wind howled like something angry, rattling the windows and shaking the trees in the front yard. I was just finishing up dinner when the doorbell rang. It wasn't unusual for someone to come by. It was the holidays, after all, and people in the neighborhood liked to stop by to introduce themselves or offer seasonal greetings. But when I opened the door, there was no one there, just the rain. And then I saw it, a small piece of paper, neatly folded, lying on the ground in front of the door. I picked it up, wondering who had left it, and unfolded it with a sense of growing unease. The message on it was short, but the words sent a chill down my spine. No one can escape their past. I stood there for a moment, staring at the words, trying to make sense of them. It was an odd, cryptic message, one that made no sense. I looked around, half expecting to see Mr. Halloran lurking somewhere in the storm. But there was nothing, only the howling wind and the endless rain. The next morning, when I was telling Jennifer about the note, we noticed something that made my blood run cold. Mr. Halloran's house was empty. It wasn't just quiet. The door was wide open, the blinds drawn, and the front yard was bare. No rocking chair, no old man sitting in the shade. Nothing. It was as if he had simply vanished overnight. I called the police, though I wasn't sure what to say. A missing persons report for an old man who had lived alone for years? It seemed ridiculous. But something about the situation didn't sit right with me. They came, took a look around, and confirmed what I already knew. There was no sign of forced entry, no sign of struggle. It was as if Mr. Halloran had just disappeared. But then things got stranger. Later that afternoon, I decided to go over to his house myself, just to see if there were any clues as to where he'd gone. I walked through the overgrown yard, the damp grass squelching under my shoes, and up to the front door. It was still wide open, though the wind had stopped howling. The house was silent, too silent. Inside, it looked like it had been abandoned for years. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs hung from the corners of the rooms. But something caught my eye. Picture frame, sitting on the mantel of the fireplace. It wasn't dusty. It was as if someone had recently touched it, moved it. Inside the frame was a photograph of Mr. Halloran, much younger, standing next to a woman and a young child, his wife and son. I assumed, but what struck me was the date written on the back of the photo, in faded ink, December 24th, 1978. I felt a sudden shiver crawl down my spine. It was the same date as the newspaper article I had found on my way in. It was a clipping from the local paper, detailing a brutal series of murders that had taken place just a few blocks from our street. The article described a family, mother, father, and child brutally killed in their own home, their bodies left in a macabre scene that shocked the small town. The murderer was never found, and the case was closed after a few years, deemed unsolvable. But Mr. Halloran was the only survivor. The old man. My heart began to race as I put the pieces together. The house we lived in was the same one the murders had taken place in. And Mr. Halloran, he had been the one who had witnessed it. He had survived it. He hadn't escaped the past. And neither would we. Later that night, as I sat in my living room, trying to make sense of it all, I heard it. A knock at the door. I froze. The wind outside had picked up again. But the knock was soft, almost tentative. I stood up slowly, my legs heavy with dread. I knew who it was before I even opened the door. But when I did, no one was there. Only the same note, this time crumpled, lying on the doorstep. No one can escape their past. It was Mr. Halloran's voice, his whisper, carried by the wind. The past hadn't just followed him. It was following us now. I never saw Mr. Halloran again, but I couldn't escape his legacy. And every night, as the wind howls and the shadows stretch long across the yard, I can still hear him whispering through the cracks of the walls. No one can escape their past. Story number 6. The Neighbor and the Strange Gift. I didn't believe in things like ghosts. At least, I didn't used to. Not until that Christmas. It was the kind of neighborhood you could find anywhere, suburbia at its most cliched. The lawns were manicured, the driveways freshly plowed after every snowstorm, and the Christmas lights twinkling like tiny stars. My wife, Emily, and I had recently moved into a house on Rosewood Avenue, a quiet little street on the outskirts of town. We were young newlyweds, eager to start our lives, filled with optimism and excitement for our new home. Everything felt fresh, pristine, and untouched. We had our whole future ahead of us, and the holiday season made everything feel even more magical. But that Christmas, everything changed. It all began with a knock on the door. It was a few days before Christmas, a chill in the air as the first snow began to fall. Emily had just finished decorating the house with the usual red ribbons and pine garlands, and I was fiddling with the tree lights. We weren't expecting anyone. But then, there was that knock. I opened the door to find a man standing on our porch, a man I had only seen in passing. He was an older gentleman, probably in his 60s, with a thin, wiry frame and a weathered face. His clothes were old-fashioned, a bit too formal for the time of year: black slacks, a dark jacket, and a bow tie that seemed a little out of place. He smiled warmly, though something about the smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Hello there. I'm your neighbor," he said, his voice soft but steady. "I live just across the street. Thought I'd stop by and wish you both a Merry Christmas." "Thank you," I said, not sure why I felt a little uneasy. "We appreciate it." He hesitated for a moment, then reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, square box, wrapped in plain brown paper. "A little gift," he continued, handing it to me with a slight bow. "For your new home." I was taken aback. We hadn't really had the chance to get to know the man yet, and now he was giving us a present, something we certainly hadn't expected. But Emily and I exchanged a quick glance, and, feeling too polite to refuse, I accepted it. "Thank you," I said again, unsure what else to say. "Of course," he replied, still smiling, though it seemed strained. "Enjoy the holidays." And with that, he turned and walked away, disappearing back into the snow-covered street. I shut the door and brought the box inside, placing it on the kitchen counter. It was small, about the size of a shoebox, and felt heavier than it looked. I could hear a faint rattling noise inside, but there was no indication of what it might be. "That was odd," Emily said as she wiped her hands on a dish towel. "I mean, we've only seen him, what, twice? Why would he give us a gift?" "I don't know," I replied, but I brushed it off. "Maybe he's just a nice guy, probably doing something nice for the holidays." Still, something about it felt off, but we didn't think much more of it. That night, we sat down to enjoy a quiet dinner, with the gift still sitting on the counter. As we ate, we could hear the wind howling outside, rattling the windows and making the house creak. But the strangest thing happened when I stood up to clear the table. The box was no longer on the counter. I turned, scanning the room, thinking I must have misplaced it, or maybe I'd left it somewhere else. But no, it was sitting squarely on the dining table, right where I had just been sitting. I asked Emily if she had moved it, but she hadn't. "It's probably nothing," I said, trying to shake off the weird sensation that had begun to crawl up my spine. Maybe I just set it down and forgot. But as the evening wore on, we both began to notice something more unsettling. Every time we turned our backs, the box seemed to shift. It wasn't a lot, just a few inches at a time, but it was enough to make us both uncomfortable. And then, around midnight, after we had gone to bed, the real horror began. I woke up to a noise, faint at first, like a soft scrape against the floor. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the house settling or maybe the wind pushing against the windows. But then I heard it again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of something small and wooden tapping against the floor. I sat up, my heart racing. It was the box, but it wasn't just sitting there anymore. The box was open. Inside, there was a doll, a small, porcelain doll with cracked features and eyes that seemed too large for its face. It was dressed in a faded blue dress, the kind of thing you'd find in an antique store, worn and frayed. I didn't know how it had gotten there, or how it had come to life, but the doll was no longer inside the box. It was standing on the floor beside the bed. I froze. It didn't move at first, but the air around it felt wrong, like something was breathing in the room, something that wasn't supposed to be there. And then, it moved, just a slight twitch of its head, as if it was looking at me. Its eyes, those unnervingly large eyes, locked onto mine. "Emily," I whispered, my voice barely a breath. "Emily, wake up." She stirred, but when she opened her eyes and saw the doll, she gasped, What is that?" Before I could answer, the doll took a step forward. Its tiny feet made a soft, hollow sound against the hardwood floor, and it began to walk, slowly but steadily, toward the edge of the bed. I jumped out of bed and grabbed it, throwing it across the room as hard as I could. The doll hit the wall with a sickening crack, but when I looked over, it was gone. The room felt colder now, A draft blew in from somewhere that didn't feel natural. And then I noticed something even worse. The smell. A faint odor, like decaying wood, mixed with something sour and rotten. We ran out of the room, slamming the door behind us. But I knew it wasn't over. I knew that whatever evil had been unleashed by that gift was still lurking in the shadows. The next morning, I took the box and the doll and drove to the local thrift store, where I dropped both items off, hoping to rid myself of them. But when I returned home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. That evening, as Emily and I sat on the couch, we heard a knock at the door. My heart dropped. I opened it to find no one there, but on the doorstep lay a small box, wrapped in plain brown paper. The same brown paper, the same box. The doll was inside, waiting for us. And the man who had given it to us, he was nowhere to be found. I did some digging, as you might expect. I couldn't get the image of that doll out of my head. I found out the worst thing possible. The neighbor, the one who had given us the gift, had been missing for years. No one knew what happened to him. Some said he had disappeared without a trace. Others claimed he had died in an accident. But no one could confirm either story. The gift had come from someone long gone. And somehow, that made it worse. I don't know what that doll was, or what it wanted, but I know one thing for sure. It never left. Still follows us. Still watching. I can't sleep at night. I can't close my eyes without feeling its cold, lifeless stare. And it's only a matter of time before it finds me again. Or maybe it already has. Story number 7. The mysterious death of the neighbor next door. I never thought I'd be the one to tell the story, but here I am, stuck in this quiet, eerie silence, with only the memories of that night to keep me company. The night when everything changed. It was winter in 1998, one of those long, bone-chilling nights where the cold doesn't just freeze your body but gnaws at your soul. The kind of night that makes you pull the covers up to your chin and wonder how anyone could ever feel safe outside, let alone in their own home. Our neighborhood, Lakeside Drive, was about as ordinary as they come. The houses were modest but cozy, with little yards that were blanketed with snow each December. A few families, a few kids, and a quiet atmosphere that would lull you into thinking that nothing bad could ever happen here. Not in a place like this, but sometimes, things happen in the quietest places. And sometimes, the bad things aren't so much loud as they are silent. It all started with the house next door. The Harrisons. I'd known them for years, but never really thought much about them. The father, Greg Harrison, was a quiet man, kept to himself mostly. His wife, Linda, was the type who would smile at you in passing, always kind but distant. And then there were the kids, Samantha, a teenager who never left the house, and young Danny, who was always running around, his red scarf flying behind him like a cape. Normal as any family could be in this suburban sprawl. But then, one night, I heard it, the sound that would change everything. It wasn't anything extraordinary at first, just a thud, followed by a creaking noise. Could have been anything, furniture being knocked over, a door closing too hard, but it sent a shiver up my spine. You know that feeling, right? The one where you hear something you know shouldn't be happening? The kind of sound that makes you get up, not out of curiosity, but out of some primal instinct to check if everything's okay. I remember standing by the window in our living room, watching the Harrisons' house. It was dark, just a single light in the kitchen still glowing. I couldn't see anything unusual, but something in me told me to keep looking, and that's when I saw it. A shadow, a figure, moving across the kitchen window. It was quick, too quick, like someone was trying to avoid being seen. At first, I thought it was just one of the kids messing around, maybe pulling a prank. But then the air in the room changed. It wasn't cold, no. It wasn't the chill of winter that made my skin prickle. It was something deeper, something darker, like the air had thickened, like it was full of a presence I couldn't see but could feel. I should have gone over, should have knocked on their door to check. But I didn't. Maybe I thought I was just being paranoid. Or maybe I was too comfortable in my own little bubble. It was late, after all, and I had kids to take care of, and a husband who was snoring in the other room. So, I let it go. The next morning, everything seemed fine. The sun was out, the birds were chirping, and there was no sign of anything being amiss. But when I looked at the Harrison house, something was wrong. The kitchen light was still on, the same light from the night before, flickering just slightly, but no one was around. There were no cars in the driveway, no sign of the family. It was as if they had simply disappeared. I didn't think much of it. People go away on vacation, right? It wasn't unheard of for someone to take a weekend trip during the holidays. I went about my day, doing the usual housework, trying to keep my mind off of whatever had happened the night before. But as hours passed, and then days, something gnawed at me. Something didn't sit right. 2 days after the disappearance, I went over to check on them. I knocked at the door, but there was no answer, no sign of life. The mailbox was full, the lawn untended. I tried calling, but there was no response. It was strange, too strange, and when I peered through the windows, everything inside looked still. It was as if the house had been frozen in time. But then, the police were called, and that's when the mystery truly began. The authorities arrived later that afternoon, and after what felt like hours of searching, they found Greg Harrison's body just outside the house in the garden, buried under a pile of snow. It wasn't an accident. The authorities quickly discovered signs of foul play. A struggle had taken place, and there were marks on Greg's neck, scratches that weren't from a fall, but from someone digging their hands in. The investigators said they found evidence of someone's boot prints leading from the house to the garden. But the snow, it seemed, had covered everything else. The strangest part? No one had heard a thing. Not the neighbors. Not me. Not even the dogs, which I'd been told barked at anything. It was like the night had swallowed everything whole. But it got worse. Much worse. The police started asking questions about Greg's family, about the neighbors, and that's when things started to take a very weird turn. People started reporting strange happenings in the days leading up to the discovery of Greg's body. One woman, Mrs. Caldwell, swore she'd seen a shadowy figure standing outside the Harrisons' house late one night, peering through the windows, its face obscured by the curtains. Another neighbor, Mr. Jacobs, claimed he had seen someone standing at the edge of his driveway, staring at his house from the corner of his eye, someone tall, with a long coat, their face hidden in the darkness. But no one remembered hearing anything. No one could recall seeing anything significant that night, as if some sort of fog had descended on the entire street, clouding people's memories. It didn't make sense. How could no one remember hearing anything? How could no one recall seeing anything out of the ordinary? And then there was the figure, the one that had appeared, or so they said, the night Greg Harrison had died. After the police left, I began to see him too, not in person, but in my dreams. The man, tall, with a long coat and a hat that covered his face, standing at the edge of my yard, watching me from the shadows. Every night, without fail, his presence, cold and heavy, pressing down on my chest as I slept. I'm not sure when it started, but it's been months now. I've stopped trying to understand it. I don't know who he is. I don't know if he's real, or just some nightmare that's burrowed deep into my subconscious. All I know is that, every night, as the darkness closes in, I feel him, watching, waiting, and I can't get rid of the feeling that the truth about that night, about Greg Harrison's death, is still out there, hidden somewhere, just beyond my reach, like the cold breath of the man who stands at the edge of my yard, waiting, and I'll never know if the answers will come, or if they'll just remain lost in the fog forever.